thank you very much for the invite. As you rightly pointed out, like I said, the kind of genesis of this as a piece of work was sort of well over a year ago now. And through the process of kind of consulting on that and getting the representations in and adopting that, you guys as a group were sort of really supportive, and the input that you offered on the consultation document gave us a really strong basis to kind of go as far as we can with this document. So sort of really indebted to you for that. I've got a short presentation to share with you. I say short, these things are all relative. Obviously there's a bit of detail to go through just to kind of give you a really good understanding of what the document is and how we're going to be applying it. But I also want to make sure we've got enough time for questions as well. So if I don't kind of pitch that quite right, then apologies for that. But I'll share my screen. Once I start doing that, I won't be able to see any hands up or anything like that. So if you've got any questions as we go through, feel free to ask them. But you'll just have to kind of shout out. So I won't see any hands up or anything. Right, bear with me.
Hi.
Okay, can everyone see the first slide? Is that okay? Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Right then. So I think the first thing to kind of clarify is what it is we're talking about. So it's the Plymouth and Southwest Devon Climate Emergency Planning Statement. In planning circles, people can get very tied up in the kind of the legal status of a document and whether or not something's a policy or not, and the whole kind of legalese of it all. We have got, as a planning authority, a statutory duty to determine planning applications in accordance with our adopted development plan. And a development plan document is something that's been through an examination in public, is assessed by the planning inspectorate, and is kind of, if you've adopted it, that's because it's been found sound by the planning inspectorate. This is not a development plan document. So it's we've been through, and intentionally we wanted to go through a kind of robust and rigorous consultation process so that we know that the document that we've adopted reflects the majority of views and the kind of broad consensus that we've got in terms of the feedback we've had to our consultation. Obviously you're not going to please everyone, but it's in effect it's a council adopted document. So it was adopted as a material consideration in determining planning applications. It's not, however, a development plan document. So because of that, the status of it in theory is less than our adopted joint local plan policies. However, we've gone to great lengths to make sure that we can explain the link between the climate emergency planning statement and the joint local plan. So we apply joint local plan policies with full weight, and we're saying that this document and the requirements within it is just a greater articulation of what the joint local plan's already looking for. So, and the reason we do that is that there is a risk in just using, if we were to just use the requirements in the climate emergency planning statement to determine planning applications, there is a risk they would very easily be overturned by the planning inspector at appeal. So we've had to be quite smart and quite pragmatic about where we've pitched this and the requirements that I'm about to kind of talk to you about now. That said, it aligns obviously with the climate emergency declarations, local and national, and they are clear material considerations in decision making as well. And there's also, a lot of you will be aware, there have been sort of relatively recent changes to the building regulations requirements as well. And again, they're all kind of pointing in the same direction. But we just need to be a little bit smart about how we use and reference specifically the requirements that I'm about to go through. So some of you may recall kind of feeding back to us in terms of the consultation, which was about a year ago now. There was obviously a strong level of support for the measures that we're introducing, but also a lot of support for us to go a lot further. And I kind of completely understand that. You won't be surprised to hear as well that some responses that we had, particularly from the development sector, suggested that we shouldn't be doing any of this, that building regulations already does a perfectly adequate job, thanks very much, and we should just wind our neck in. Clearly that wasn't going to happen. We had a very clear mandate from members, both at South Hams and West Devon, and they should be congratulated for this, to push as far as we could, recognizing the status of what we can do with this as an interim piece of work. But they wanted something that they could use in the short term that would give them the tools to more accurately and effectively reflect the nature of the climate emergency and the decisions that they were making. And I'm hoping that we've kind of pitched it right. We haven't had any challenge yet, but it's still very early days. It has the other things that we did in terms of the consultation with this document, and this was quite a useful kind of learning process for us, is that we tried to be a bit more proactive in terms of the groups that we wanted to engage. So you guys included, but also recognizing what a lot of the pushback was going to be. We proactively sought discussions with the likes of building control, the heat pump association, SAP assessors, because we knew what the pushback would be from developers. Things like heat pumps are noisy, we can't get hold of them, building regulations does everything that we need to do, etc., etc. We wanted to be forewarned and forearmed, and so we were more proactive in the way that we consulted with the groups that we wanted to engage with, and that I think has worked really well. And I think that will stand us in good stead when it comes to when we write the next version of the joint local plan as well, which will hopefully include another step change in terms of what our climate policies do and seek to achieve. So you guys will know all this, but the reason I'm sharing this with you, and actually all of the first 3 slides, is that these slides have been used with developers, agents, local architects, and internally development management officers and staff. So we want to try and make sure that everyone's kind of aligned in their understanding of what this document does and how we're going to apply these requirements, but also why we're doing it. And everyone comes to this discussion with a kind of different level of knowledge and expertise of the wider issues. But I'm, I imagine, without making too many assumptions, that you guys are going to be one of the better informed audiences that I'm talking to about this. But you'll kind of recognise all of these as the issues that kind of gave us the clear motivation for doing this as a document in the first place. But there are some sort of clear and fundamental things that we can fall back on that provide adequate justification for this as a document and the requirements we've got in these. But also, it's kind of, in doing this as an exercise, it's given us an opportunity to kind of look into the future a little bit and think about how we can use this as a document as a stepping stone to where we want the next set of climate policies to get to, which I am hopeful will be, again, like they will look much more ambitious and much more aligned with what we need to do in the short and medium term, rather than just focusing on 2050. I like to think that the next version of the joint local plan will again be demonstrably more challenging and set again a much higher bar than we've got at the moment. And I suppose that's so recognizing the status of this as a piece of work. When I go through the requirements I'm about to show you, I'm in no way pretending that it's adequate in terms of what we really need to do in terms of the response to the climate emergency. It was an exercise in pragmatism, and we've had to kind of find a kind of middle ground in terms of what a lot of people wanted us to do, but also recognizing some of the pushback we've had from the development sector. So it doesn't go as far as I would like it to. It probably doesn't go as far as any of you guys want it to either, but I'm hoping that you kind of understand the reason for it not doing that, and kind of how we've tried to kind of occupy that middle ground and kind of set this document up as a bit of a stepping stone to something a lot more ambitious. So the document is divided into kind of 2 sections: mitigation measures and adaptation measures. Load more detail in the mitigation measures. Planning as a kind of function, it has been reasonably passive in terms of how we've dealt with adaptation. And again, we're looking to be a lot more proactive next time round. I'll come on to talk about the adaptation measures after we've done these. So I'm going to focus on these. I'm going to try and skip through these relatively quickly, although some of them do require a little bit of detail. But I just want to make sure that we've got enough time for questions, and we can always kind of come back to these at a different time if need be. So on-site, so the first one is about on-site renewable generation. This isn't necessarily a kind of new requirement. We've already got an adopted joint local plan policy that requires this. Albeit what we used to do, and what most councils used to do, is you would end up kind of negotiating and horse trading an equivalent, like the energy hierarchy suggests that you reduce your demand for energy in the first place, which is a much better way of trying to manage and reduce your overall carbon emissions associated with the use of a building. because building regs have been improved in 2021, and that again, that's kind of a transition towards the Future Home Standard in 2025. We don't really need now to kind of horse trade around improving the thermal efficiency of a building, given that regs has already introduced a reasonable, an equivalent 30% uplift over 2013 regs. We can now just apply our joint local plan policy exactly as it's written, which says 20% equivalent carbon reduction from on-site generation. What this document does differently is that we are now applying this to all applications, including minors. So it used to be just for major applications, which is development proposals or over 10 dwellings and non-domestic development proposals of over 1,000 square meters. We're now saying that we're going to apply this to minor. So anything from a single building upwards, we'll be looking for an on-site renewable energy generation system that meets at least 20% of the carbon reductions, of the carbon emissions that the building's going to generate. We kind of use, obviously, we need to align this with building regulations because we need to know what the baseline is from building regs in order to be able to calculate what a 20% saving is. So we've had to do a little bit of work with colleagues to understand how to read and understand a SAP assessment, for example. Introducing planning officers to terminology like the target emissions rate, and to understand how to convert things like the installed capacity of a PV system into equivalent carbon savings. So it's been a little bit of a learning process for development management officers. Most of them have been really keen to kind of engage with this, even though they've kind of up to their eyes with caseloads and stuff like that. Most of them spend every day of their working life kind of consenting buildings, but very few of them up until now have really had the opportunity or reason to kind of understand how those buildings work. So this is kind of a sort of real step in the right direction for them. The other new thing that this as a requirement introduces is the notion of including on-site renewables on an extension. Now, this is quite a difficult one to manage because we haven't usually or up until now kind of tended to deal that much with the associated carbon impact of an extension, because we get hundreds and hundreds of householder applications. Some of them are absolutely tiny. It's quite difficult, and you don't routinely need to produce a SAP assessment for an extension. There is a building regs requirement, a compliance requirement, of course, but it's kind of trying to pitch the level of our requirement in a kind of proportionate and appropriate way, so that we are going to achieve a degree of betterment, but also that we don't just create a whole load of resource implication for us and applicants. So the expectations of PV on an extension, and I say PV because more often than not it's going to be PV. It's unlikely to be things like a wind turbine or sort of micro hydro or anything like that. Is that it's a degree of nudge theory, and I kind of use the kind of the term advisedly. There's a whole load of circumstances where it might not be appropriate to stick PV on an extension. And there might be a number of reasons, like the relationship with the host building, overshading from the building, shade from gardens, hedges, trees, what have you. It might not have the right aspect or orientation, or the host building might already have a load of PV on it. So there's a number of things that when it comes to extensions, we're suggesting that we take a bit of a case-by-case basis. Not every extension is going to have the capability to introduce an optimally efficient PV system. But what we have seen since we've applied this is that a number of extensions are coming in with PV systems that they wouldn't have done previously. So in terms of trying to pitch this right, there might be some opportunities perhaps that we miss, but I think in broad terms, as long as we see more extensions coming in with PV than we would have done otherwise, recognizing the status of this document and what we can and can't do with it, I kind of recognize that as a benefit, and I think it's a reasonably positive outcome of that as a requirement. So this is the kind of all the stuff I went through with DM officers and agents, helping them to kind of understand how they calculate the baseline emissions, helping to understand how they convert installed kilowatt capacity into carbon savings. excuse me. So this is the sort of thing that I've done with DM officers. The eagle-eyed among you will recognise that these SAP assessments are out of date. So these were generated using 2012 software. The target emissions rate, you'll see the average is around about sort of 20 kilograms per meter squared. The good news is that since the introduction of 2021 Part L and the updating to SAP 10 software, the average expectation of kilograms of CO2 per meter squared is now somewhere around 8 or 9. So it's a pretty significant drop in terms of what the baseline is. This is an example from this is a non-domestic building here, and you'll see the target emissions rate down there, 9.6, much lower than it would have been when people were using SAP 2012. So I've kind of run through this with DM officers, again, sort of trying to get them in a position where they're comfortable with interrogating the installed capacity of a PV system. So how they can kind of calculate that by looking at the wattage of each panel and kind of multiplying that by the number of panels that you've got in the system, and then converting that into carbon saved. And this has been a bit of a change as well in terms of the carbon factors that are built into the SAP 10 software, significantly less than SAP 2012. And you can see even from the first iteration of the SAP 10 software in July 2018. So the carbon equivalent savings per kilowatt reflects the effectively the decarbonisation of the national grid. So the fact we've got a lot more offshore wind, and strategic scale solar, that tells us that the energy saved by a domestic PV system is going down because the carbon associated with energy that comes out the grid is less. However, you'll notice that the carbon factors for things like mains gas don't go down because fossil fuel, the impact of fossil fuels when you burn them is the same. So helping DM officers and applicants to kind of understand how we convert the installed capacity of a PV system into carbon savings, they kind of have to understand how carbon factors work, how they change over time for certain energy sources. And so we get ourselves to a position where we're able to kind of talk them through calculations of what's being saved and so on and so forth. DM officers are kind of being upskilled in doing that. You guys don't necessarily need to look at that or comment on that when you're looking at planning applications, albeit you are now more emboldened to kind of look at and insist on solar PV, because that is now more of an absolute requirement from the joint local plan policy. So hopefully I imagine that's the sort of thing that you guys would have been looking for anyway, but I feel that we now have a sort of greater level of ability to insist on that. Obviously there will still be examples or situations where for whatever reason somebody says they can't do it, and we have to leave a little bit of room for them to make that case in a planning application, albeit I'd like to think that unless the circumstances are really unfavorable, we would be requiring this on the vast majority of applications now. So skipping on to the next one. Now, I mentioned nudge theory earlier. This is a classic example of this. We've got it, although it's called a requirement, it's not. We're not really being absolute in terms of how we require this. We're not requiring battery storage, to be clear. What we are requiring is someone to show, marked on a plan, internal or external, recognizing how kind of energy storage systems have evolved over the last few years, where the potential future installation of an energy storage system could go. Now, in doing this, we just want to plant a seed in someone's mind, the applicant, the architect or the agent, of the fact that an energy storage system is a benefit to a property. It enables them to use their energy much more smartly, especially since we're requiring on-site energy generation as well now. In asking them to consider where it might go, that may convert itself to some applicants deciding to put it in straight away. It might not, but at least we know that they have given some thought about where it might go at some point in the future. It might not even be them, it might be a future owner or occupant, but at least we know that someone has given it a little bit of thought, because planning has very little jurisdiction over the inside of a building. So this is just a bit of a nudge towards them thinking about this as a component of kind of how they use their energy both now and in the future. So again, we'll just be looking for something to be marked on a floor plan. Again, you guys can kind of keep an eye out for that if you feel the need when you're kind of looking at applications. But again, it's something else that DM officers should be looking for. This is a slightly wordy requirement, this one, and this is kind of one of the key reasons why members wanted us to do this piece of work in the first place. Low and zero carbon space and water heating systems. Now, we've written that. What it kind of means is no new gas or oil boilers, but we couldn't have a requirement that said that because planning is all about positive phraseology. So what we do want is pretty much, we're saying that we want heat pumps in all new buildings now. Doesn't have to be heat pumps, of course. Again, we leave the door open for other technology, but recognizing that that's probably where most people are going to go, especially because we're also requiring on-site generation as well. The technologies work very well in tandem. And again, we'll be using SAP assessments or like a UK BRL assessment or something to kind of confirm what the primary heating system of a building is. And that should just say that it's a heat pump. I think we've got an example. Yeah, so I think it's like section 4. It just confirms what the heating system of a building is. This is part of the reason why we proactively engage with the Heat Pump Association, as well as we didn't want to put ourselves and applicants and developers in a difficult position. We didn't want to inadvertently kind of stifle the supply of new housing because of the difficulty of acquiring or installing heat pumps. I'm reliably assured that there isn't a kind of imminent supply shortage, and we also need to recognise that these requirements only apply to new planning applications from the 1st of December last year. So that unfortunately, the thousands of homes we've got within our supply already, we aren't retroactively applying these requirements to them. And again, that's partly because if we were to do that, I'm sure an applicant would be most disgruntled and would take us to appeal and would go to the planning inspectorate, and they would suggest that this isn't something we can actually do retroactively to an existing planning permission. So, realistically, we're probably talking about maybe a couple of hundred buildings to start with across the plan area. The heat pump sector is more than able to kind of meet that level of additional demand. There's already a reasonably high level of demand, as I'm sure you can understand. Kind of people becoming more and more aware of heat pumps as a technology and as an alternative to gas and oil boilers. So the unintended consequence of us applying this has been kind of discussed, researched, and understood, and I think the risk is pretty low. So again, that's something that you should be looking out for, particularly in areas where perhaps a building might be off grid. Certainly no bottled gas, no oil boilers. There should be pretty obvious that the new heating system is probably going to be heat pump, and that should be clearly marked in the documentation that someone submits with a planning application. Excuse me. Now, the next one came about from input from our development management colleagues, actually, and it's a slightly confusing one to get your head around. DM officers suggest that they often get things like material samples to look at, and so this is quite a narrow. There's quite a narrow lens that we look at this through. So we're talking about roofing and building slate. So roofing slate that you might see used as kind of pavers or sills, for example. Typically, DM officers have been asked to approve slate samples based on pretty much the color and the tone. Do they match the local vernacular? Do they match? Are they kind of reasonably compatible with surrounding buildings? That kind of thing.
Do they come from China?
Exactly that. So we wanted to give them the basis to kind of understand a whole wider set of implications in terms of the slates that they were being asked to look at in terms of their level of acceptability, and obviously where they come from is going to dictate the vast majority of the environmental impact of that as a product. And I always try to be a little bit careful here, because I often reference Brazilian and Chinese slates, and I'm not trying to single out any one country or other, but recognizing kind of the nature and type of the products that are available on the open market. Those tend to be the cheaper ones, and they often come with an associated lower or shorter warranty period. So looking into it as well, and again, this is based a little bit on generalized assumptions, and I don't wish to kind of sound lazy in the phraseology that I'm using. There is often a higher environmental impact of the extraction methods in Brazil and China compared to the regulated extraction processes that you get within the EU. So what we're saying is with this one, this is only where we require a natural slate product. So typically this will be something like a conservation area or a building that is perhaps within the setting of a listed building or in a sensitive location. This doesn't apply to all buildings. And the reason why it doesn't apply to all buildings is the unintended consequence of doing this to all buildings might be that a developer says, I don't want to accord with your hierarchy of acceptance for natural slate, so I'm going to use a man-made product instead. Now, that obviously has a different but equally high level of environmental impact, depending on the kind of processing that you use to create the man-made slate. So so this is why we're only kind of prescribing this in situations where, and often it is more around the kind of requirement of sort of a conservation or kind of heritage impact or setting or something like that. Where we do require a natural slate product, we are saying that those slates ideally will be reclaimed UK or European slates, or new slates from the UK or from Europe. So recognizing as well that 80% of the slate that kind of comes to market pretty much in the UK market comes from northern Spain anyway. The products are available, and there is a broad enough range of products from within the UK and Europe to meet most heritage and conservation requirements in terms of finding a kind of suitable color, hue and tone and all that kind of stuff. So again, we've kind of tested the potential implications of this. I think some case officers kind of did this on an ad hoc basis already anyway, in terms of how they engage with applicants. And again, I think like for the most part, the benefits of this are going to sort of far outweigh any kind of potential implications. There might be the occasional issue around sort of supply and availability, but I really don't think at the scale we're talking about that this is going to be a particularly big deal. That said, I think that the benefits in terms of reducing the environmental impact of potential products is reasonably significant on a case-by-case basis. Excuse me. Now, this is possibly kind of the biggest change or the most proactive requirement that we've got in this document, and it can be a little bit complicated to explain. Essentially, it is we don't really want people to demolish and rebuild perfectly good buildings. What we do want is people to retrofit an existing building, and if they feel that they need more space, by all means retrofit and extend an existing building. The intention of this is that people kind of consider the requirement, look at the level of benchmarking that they're going to need to demonstrate, and look at the level of performance that they're going to need a new building to perform at, and just decide to retrofit a building rather than demolish it. That is the best outcome for this as a requirement. When somebody, and I mean, you guys will probably all recognize this as a scenario. If a building gets purchased because it's on a spectacular plot, but the owner of the building doesn't like the building, often the temptation between the client and the architect is just to kind of flatten it and start again. That has a significant environmental impact in terms of the loss of embodied carbon. If we recognize though that at that stage somebody is already kind of committed to a project at a kind of whole house level, that is the best time to consider retrofit, because retrofit is kind of best deployed at a whole house level. So when you kind of consider all aspects and elements of that building as a structure, if you're kind of committed to doing something at that scale anyway, then you can achieve a really high level of retrofit outcome. So recognizing what the aim is of this as a requirement, we kind of want people to retrofit. We don't want people to demolish. We've got a kind of methodology that kind of seems a little bit contrived, but basically we are asking people to offset the net carbon cost of the project, so the loss of embodied carbon in the building that they're demolishing, and the upfront embodied carbon of the replacement structure. We're asking, can you offset that carbon cost within 25 years just through operational energy savings of the new building? So I kind of got have I got, there we go. So I've kind of got an example here. And again, these figures are entirely contrived just to see if I can make the maths work. You've got roughly 19 tons of carbon in an existing building. The replacement building's approximately 64 tons, and you're able to kind of reuse and recycle about 13 tons of materials, both on site or off site. That gives you a net carbon cost of around about 70 tons of CO2 for the overall project. In order to kind of calculate what the carbon cost is of something, kind of looking at the embodied carbon and that, like through a whole life cycle assessment, there are software packages out there, and kind of collectively as a council, we bought an annual license to something called One-Click LCA, and so we've kind of tested the kind of usability and the sort of flexibility of the inputs to things like this as a software package. And generally, they kind of all conform with a European standard EN 15978. It's recognised by RICS, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, as being a kind of robust methodology. So what we've said is that when you calculate the kind of net carbon cost of a project, whatever software you use, and we're not kind of prescribing what software people use, you need to make sure that your software accords with that standard, just to make sure that we've got a reasonable amount of consistency of the information that we're being given. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will also notice that this calculation kind of uses a target emissions rate that's based on SAP 2012 software, and that's because when we kind of first worked up some examples, we didn't have any SAP 10 assessments to look at. It was too early. So as an example, you calculate the annual savings, the operational savings of a building, comparing the target emissions rate from your SAP assessment with your dwelling emissions rate. That gives you a kind of net operational saving. This one saves about 1.5 tons of CO2 per annum against the building regs baseline. If you times that by 25 years, it gets you 37.5 tons of CO2. So going back to what we need to achieve, 70 tons, they're only halfway there. They're not even close. So this, as a notional project, example one, that isn't going to meet the requirement of what it is we're looking for in terms of justification for demolition and rebuild. Example two. So this was taken from an actual SAP assessment that we saw last year. That again, the target emissions rate is pretty high, actually 22.5 kilograms per meter squared. That obviously that's very much an expression of SAP 2012. The dwelling emissions rate, so the actual specification of the building that was proposed, is 3 kilograms per meter squared, which is pretty good. Obviously, it gives you a significant saving against the building regs baseline. If you times that annual saving by 25, that actually saves 73.3 tons of carbon. So that does exceed the 70 tons that we were requiring them to meet, and that would meet the requirements of this as a policy. As a requirement, sorry, it's not a policy. This, as a planning application, would still be subject to all of our adopted planning policies as well. So this isn't the only benchmark, but this is the one benchmark that we're applying that takes into account the wider environmental impact of just the notion of a demolition and rebuild project. If you kind of cast your mind back to what I said the average target emissions rate was from SAP 10, which is around between 8 and 10 of kilograms of CO2 per meter squared, the potential savings for a replacement building are obviously much more limited. Whether or not it's even possible for a demolition and rebuild project to meet a 25-year offset period, recognizing how low the target emissions rate has gone from SAP 10, I don't know yet. The idea was that we wanted to try and pitch this in terms of the offset period. We wanted to pitch this in a way that was demanding, but it wasn't unachievable, because we have to kind of leave a little bit of room for people to kind of respond positively to this, and it might yet happen. Some of the development sector said that the offset period should be 50 years, which to me kind of sounded much too generous and wouldn't necessarily have set the bar very high. We had some people who said that the offset period should be 10 years, which I think is nigh on impossible within the current building regulations regime. So 25 years is kind of where we pitch that, but I've yet to see many examples of this some of the feedback has been that it's been a little bit difficult for people to get to calculate the embodied carbon of a project, but whether or not that's true, I don't exactly know yet. So I'm gonna skip on because time is quite tight. EV charging points is a reasonably simple one. There's a new building regulations requirement, approved document Part S. We just generally sort of defer to that. The only thing that we're saying differently is that for non-domestic buildings, that because recognizing that people aren't at these buildings very long, we just want a faster, a high capacity of charger, just to kind of give people a slightly faster charge. And again, that we're asking that they to mark that on the plans that they submit to us. Active and sustainable travel, it is nothing really new. This is stuff that we've already got in our joint local plan. It's about not relying on the car. It's about modal shift. It's about enabling people to walk and cycle as much as possible, and utilize and use rural public transport services, recognizing that the backdrop to that is ever diminishing service, ever diminishing investment. But we want to try and kind of increase patronage of those as much as possible. And again, the requirements themselves kind of don't really introduce anything new until you get to a scheme of over 50 dwellings. And that's where we prescribe an applicant to actually look at the opportunities for things like on-site car clubs or e-bike hire. And if they can't do it on-site, we ask them to do a sort of local survey of what's available locally for in a local town. And development of this scale is most likely going to be at a sort of town level. Is there anything they can input into in terms of off-site contributions that would perhaps make an existing facility a bit more sustainable? So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of the mitigation measures. Adaptation, again, these measures aren't really new. The adaptation measures that we've got that we've included in this as a document kind of drawn from existing joint local plan policies, but they're not in the joint local plan. They're not really badged as adaptation requirements. We don't really recognize the outputs from the joint local plan policies for their adaptation benefits. We kind of look at them generally a little bit in isolation. So part of what we wanted to achieve with adaptation in this document is to recognize the sort of cumulative benefits of a number of different adaptive measures that we're looking for. The first one was around passive solar design. Now, we have decided not to apply this, and there is a very good reason for that. Firstly, managing the risk of overheating is a new approved document, Part O, that is kind of considered through building regulations. The reason why we include it to start with was because of early engagement with building control colleagues. They wanted the ability for planning to consider overheating at planning stage, because otherwise, if they get a building, by the time it's built and building control come to sign it off, if it doesn't comply with overheating regulations because the windows are too big, someone's going to have to come back through planning anyway to kind of change the elevations of their building. So they wanted us to kind of use a checklist from Part O, which is kind of, whenever you ask a planning officer to do the job of a building control officer and vice versa, it kind of puts us in a position where you might get slightly inconsistent outcomes. And having reviewed the joint local plan policies and what we've got in our supplementary planning document, it's already pretty robust and detailed around designing to achieve sort of passive solar benefit, but also minimizing the risk of overheating. So we've decided not to apply this. We only really kind of found this out a week or two after we adopted the document, but in the interest of us kind of being responsive to the feedback that we've got and being sort of pragmatic about what we're going to be looking for, we've decided that the best thing to do here is just to kind of say that we're not going to apply it, and we'll just rely on our existing guidance and knowing that there is a new and improved mechanism through building control. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because I'm kind of mindful that we want to leave a bit of time for some questions. You'll recognize that there are adaptive benefits of all of these kind of requirements. These all kind of have hooks to the joint local plan policies already. Planning as a system isn't typically very proactive when it comes to generating adaptation outcomes. We want the joint local plan next time around to be much more expressive about adaptation, much clearer about what a good adaptation response looks like. We'll link to the Devon, Cornwall and Isles of Scilly adaptation strategy as well, so that the plan that kind of sits underneath the Devon carbon plan, we don't need to kind of rewrite any of this. We can kind of point to best practice where the opportunities exist. What we are going to do, though, is we're developing something called a green space factor tool, which again, we'll be consulting on that in due course, but that uses a pretty accessible methodology. You kind of just look at every square meter of a development proposal and you score it on its adaptation benefits, and you can therefore you set like a minimum threshold score for adaptation benefits, and it kind of then it sort of penalizes things like a kind of a sort of blacktop tarmac drive, and it provides a much higher score for things that offer additional soil resource, water attenuation, supports biodiversity and habitat, and that kind of stuff. So it's much more of a whole site approach to adaptation, rather than a planning application just focusing on the building and then being passive and neutral in terms of the land that surrounds it. The idea is that we're much more proactive in terms of the adaptation benefits that we secure. I'll just quickly talk you through this, which is the kind of process by which we ask an applicants to show that they have met the requirements, or at least addressed the requirements in the climate emergency planning statement. This is a validation requirement, so applicants have to provide this, and this is something that you guys will be able to kind of look for when you look at planning applications that are submitted. It just says, are the requirements being met? Now, they might put not at all. They might put they're not meeting any of these, and they might provide what they think is justification for doing that. In the fullness of time, they could do that in order to get their planning application validated, but the planning application will be refused. So it's not in their interest to do that. They do need to kind of engage positively with these as requirements, but we can't make them do it.